How's everyone? Could everybody hear me? Yeah, you hear me. Okay. So I just want to remind everybody, feel free to type a question into the box. I know it's over Zoom, but it's like a class. So if you have a question and you want more clarity or something like that, just type it in the box. I'll be happy to address it. So we come to the Torah portion of Tetzaveh. Again, I don't know which book you're holding in front of you, but I am on page 464 in the Blue Article Chumash. In any other book, it's the tail end of chapter 27 in the book of Exodus, the book of Shemos, okay? So, what is the topic of this week's Torah portion? So, you know the expression dress for success or clothing make the man? Well, the big topic of this week's Torah portion is actually clothing. It's all about the wardrobe of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, and the regular Kohanim. Last week we read about fashioning the tabernacle and all the vessels in the Mishkan. Now we're going to read about the garments that the high priest wore. There were 8 special garments. And my Chumash, I have the Oscar Chumash, even has some diagrams of what it looked like. So we come to the subject of clothing and priesthood. So the Kohanim. And we always remember that we are called a nation of Kohanim. We are Mamlechet Kohanim. So it's not just the literal Kohens, but every Jew is a Kohen. So the lessons of the priesthood and the garments of the Kohen on some level pertain to each and every one of us. So let us begin with an interesting observation about this week's Torah portion that all the commentaries talk about, and there's many, many answers given to this question. It's an old question, and that is that this week's Torah portion is the only Torah portion where Moses' name is omitted from his birth in Shemot until the end of Numbers, which means the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Before we start Deuteronomy, which is Moses' repetition of the Torah, every Torah portion has his name in it, often multiple times. Moshe is most probably the most famous name in the Torah. But yet, this week's Torah portion, you will not find the name Moshe. And it's not because Moses isn't being discussed. The very first word says, and you shall command the children of Israel to bring the oil for the menorah. And then you shall command your brother and his children to serve as the priest. And then you shall command the artisans to fashion the clothing for the Kohen. Every one of these, and you, is referring to Moses, but he's deliberately not mentioned by name. It doesn't say, and God told Moses, tell the Jewish people. It says, you shall. And our rabbis discuss this. And what thickens the plot, so to speak, is the fact that on Friday we observed the 7th day of Adar, which was the birthday and the passing of Moses. He died on his birthday at the age of 120. It was 7th day of Adar. Tetzaveh always comes in close proximity, if not on the very week of Moses' birthday and yahrzeit. So here we have his day of celebration and day of birth and his day of passing, which is, by the way, very much connected to the story of Purim, which this Friday is the minor Purim because it's in the first Adar. But there's the second Adar coming up. We will celebrate Purim, but we're already in the Purim mode because this week is Purim Katan. And we know that the rabbis tell us that Haman chose the month of Adar because he said this is a good time to destroy the Jews because it's a bad month for them. Their leader, Moses, died. But he didn't know that Moses was also born in Adar. So it wasn't just the passing, it was the happy day of his birth. But usually on a person's birthday, you talk about them more, not less. On the day of a person's passing, you talk about them more, not less. How could it be that the Torah portion connected to the birth and passing of Moses makes no mention of Moshe? So the famous classical answer is that at the story of the golden calf, which is next week, and rebuild the Jewish nation through Moses. And Moses pleads for forgiveness for the Jewish people. And then he, in typical Jewish leadership fashion, chutzpah, he says to God an ultimatum. And he says, God, if you forgive the Jewish people, fine. If not, wipe me out of your Torah. I don't want to be part of the Torah. Moses says, I'm not going to be a leader that's going to be going to sit by while my flock is destroyed. And he compels God to forgive the Jewish people. But God says, because you uttered those words, wipe me out of your Torah, even though it was conditional, and I did forgive the Jewish people, because you said that, I will wipe you out of one Torah portion, which is this Torah portion which coincides with your birthday and your passing. And our rabbis explain it's not a punishment for Moses, but it actually shows the greatness of Moses. And he was willing to forfeit, he was willing to surrender his relationship with the Torah, which is his whole life. You know, a musician loves music, an artist loves art. Moses loved Torah, but he said, take my name out of the Torah. I'll detach myself from the Torah just to defend and protect the Jewish people. Because while I may love the Torah, I love the Jewish people even more. And so I'll sacrifice and risk my relationship with Torah for the sake of my relationship with the Jewish people. So that's one answer. But I want to share a second answer, perhaps. What happened when God came to Moses at the burning bush? He said, I want you to go take the Jews out of Egypt. And Moses tried every way not to go. And finally he said to God, what about my older brother? The book of Genesis, Bereshit, was filled with sibling rivalry. And Moses says, I want to, you had Jacob, you had Ishmael and Isaac didn't get along. And then Jacob and Esau didn't get along. You had Cain and Abel all the way back to Adam and Eve's children didn't get along. And then Joseph and the brothers. So Moses says, I don't want to offend my brother, take away his role. He should be the one to take the Jews out of Egypt. And God says to Moses something really remarkable. God says to Moses, go and take the Jews out of Egypt, and don't worry about Aaron, because he will see you and rejoice in his heart, meaning he will be happy that you were selected for the mission. He won't be jealous. And God knows the heart of a person, that he's not just going to rejoice on his face, externally, outwardly, but inwardly hold a grudge against his brother, but he'll be genuinely happy for his brother. So sure enough, Moses goes. And Moses and Aaron are the first model. You do have Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph, who were not jealous when Jacob crisscrossed his hands to put the right hand on the younger brother, Ephraim over Manasseh. But in a way, the story of Moses and Aaron even goes beyond Ephraim and Manasseh, because Manasseh didn't react when Ephraim got the greater blessing, but it doesn't say he rejoiced that his younger brother got the greater blessing. Here, Aaron rejoices that his younger brother got chosen for this mission to take the Jews out of Egypt. So Moses and Aaron are the model of brotherly love, breaking the cycle of sibling rivalry throughout the book of Bereshit. They take it to a whole new height. So Moses is the leader par excellence, the greatest prophet of the Jewish people, the ultimate Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher. And I love pointing out, in case somebody didn't hear this, how many commandments did we get? We have 613 commandments, 365 negative, 248 positive. And we know that it says Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe. The Torah was taught to us by Moses. Moses is Moses, our teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu. He taught us the 613 commandments. Believe it or not, I don't have a blackboard here, so you'll trust me, but you could go home and do it yourself. As you know, every letter in Hebrew has a numerical value. So Aleph is 1, and Beis is 2, and Gimel is 3, and then when you get to Yud, it's 10, and then Chaf is 20 and 30, and then when you get to Kuf, it's 100, and Reish is 200. If you add up the letters Moshe, Mem, Shin, Hey, it equals 345. So we got 345, right? Moshe. And then if you add up Rabbeinu, You have Resh is 200, Beis is 2, that's 202. I'm sorry, that's 202. Yud is 10, that's 212. Nun is 50, that's 262. And then the Vav makes it 6, 268. How much is 268 plus 345? 268 plus 345 is 613. The very name Moshe Rabbeinu, which is the 8 letters of Moshe, 3 of Moshe and Rabbeinu of our teacher, equal 613. Moses taught us the 613 commandments. But this week's Torah portion is not about Moses. It's about his brother Aaron, who is the high priest. And what the Torah is teaching us is something very powerful. Moses says, take my name out of this week's Torah portion. Let the spotlight be on my brother. I'm mentioned all the time. Let this be his Torah portion. Yeah, I'm involved, but don't even mention me by name. And this is a very powerful idea of what leadership is. Leadership means you make room for someone else and welcome other voices into the conversation and know how to listen and be silent, not just to always be the leader talking. And so a good leader knows how to not only omit and exude leadership, but also how to restrain and contract themselves to make room for someone else. And that's what Moses shows us, how he does it with his brother Aaron. He gives him this week's Torah portion. You know, it says that Moses was like the son, and Joshua, who took over his disciple, which, by the way, Saturday was the 8th day of Adar, a day after Moses died. So this past Shabbat was the first day of Joshua's reign as a leader of the Jewish people, right? So it says that Moses was like the sun and Joshua was like the moon. Now, what does that mean? So typically it means that the moon is a lesser light than the sun. The moon also reflects the light of the sun. So Joshua reflected the light of Moses. But there's another beautiful idea here. You know, the stars are in the heaven all the time. But during the day, the sunlight is so bright that you can't see. It eclipses the light of the stars. Only at night, because the light of the moon isn't as powerful, suddenly all the stars appear. And the powerful lesson is that sometimes you could have a leader who's so great and so dominant that there's no room for any other stars. There's no rooms for anyone else's light to radiate. Why? Because the light of the sun is so powerful, right? Therefore, what do you need? Sometimes you have a lesser leader like a Joshua. And what does that do? That allows you to see the stars. So a leader has to know how to lead, but also know how to contract themselves. And Moses shows us how he contracts himself, removes himself in the Torah portion in order to let his brother Aaron shine in this week's Torah portion. There's a lot of great stories about great leaders who knew how to do that, to make room for others. But there's another idea here, and that is that, you know, in leadership, there is in Jewish leadership, there are two different forms of leadership. There's actually 3 forms of leadership. There's the prophet, which is like Moshe Rabbeinu. There is the priest, which is Aaron, and then there's the king. It's a trifecta, so to speak. Okay? And Moses is the at the moment he was actually the king and the prophet, and his brother was the priest. And what the Torah is saying is that you need both brothers. In other words, you need both roles of leadership, and they serve different functions and they complement one another. There's no one person that could be the totality of leadership. So the priest versus the prophet is very different. And I'm going to show you how it manifests itself in our daily prayers, actually. When you think about a prophet, the prophet didn't have, I told you in the beginning that this week's Torah portion is about clothing, the wardrobe of the high priest. And we know exactly what the high priest wore. But what about Moses? Does anyone know what what Moshe Rabbeinu wore? Did he have a special wardrobe? And the answer is no, he didn't. The question is, if Aaron needs a wardrobe, why doesn't Moses need a wardrobe? Why doesn't the prophet wear a special set of clothing? And this is a very lengthy subject, but just to like frame it a little bit, you see, there's a major distinction between Moses and Aaron, which is prophecy versus priesthood. You see, Moses' children didn't become the next prophets. He had two sons, Gershon and Eliezer. They did not succeed him. Joshua did, as we just mentioned. Aaron's children continued to succeed their parents from generation to generation. In other words, prophecy is based on individual merit. Priesthood is not based on individual merit. It is a power or a role or responsibility, a sacred responsibility that's invested in a certain family. So therefore, it's not about the individual as much as the office, the title of the position. So a prophet, it's a more of a inward qualification. They have this spiritual ability to prophesize, to connect with God on a very lofty level. Now, the priest also was a lofty spiritual person, but it wasn't that they earned it through their own greatness necessarily. It was awarded to them. It was bestowed upon them, and they were given this authority, this power, this ability. And that's why Moses didn't need a tabernacle to be Moses. He could prophesize anywhere. Yes, he would go into the tent of meeting as well, but the Kohen needed an office. That was the tabernacle. He needed a wardrobe. That was his special vestment, right? Because it's the power and the prestige of the position. You know, when the president of the United States speaks anywhere, right? When the president of the United States speaks, they always on the podium put the seal of the president of the United States, right? So whichever president you are, you hold the office of the president. You have the Oval Office, right? It's a certain prestige that comes with the power of the position. That's what a Kohen is, versus a priest, which is more individual. It's not based on the title, the office, the wardrobe, or anything like that. Now, let's continue to talk about those differences between a priest and a prophet, right? Another difference is that priesthood is associated with ritual. Ritual is a pattern of consistent behaviors. That's what makes it ritual. We do this at this time, we do this on this occasion. There's rituals, right? As opposed to prophecy, which is spontaneous. Whenever the prophet gets a message, he delivers it. God calls the prophet, right? And they prophesize. So the question is, which one do you need? Do you need, I'm sorry to interrupt, Janet, we see your camera. It's a little bit, the walking is a little bit, thank you. So basically, there's two parts to life. There's the priest and the prophet. If I ask you, what's more important, spontaneity or consistency? Right? It's a ridiculous question. Why? Because you really need both. in life. You can't just be spontaneous all the time. No problem. We understand, Janet. You can't just be spontaneous, but you can't just be consistent. You need both elements in your life. You need the consistency, right? Every one of us has certain roles, responsibilities as a human being and as a Jew. You know what I mean? You have your rituals, you get up, you brush your teeth, you do your certain things, right? Day in, day out, you make your coffee, whatever you do. You have your Jewish rituals. You get up, you say Moda Ani, you thank God for waking you up, you say your blessings, you know, all the Jewish rituals. Shabbat has rituals, holidays have rituals. But you can't just have fixed rituals, because then it just becomes rote. It just becomes perfunctory. It just becomes mechanical. It loses its spark. It loses its fire. It loses its passion. So you could do everything right according to all the rituals, but there's no heart, there's no feeling, there's no spontaneity, there's no enthusiasm. So you need both elements. You need the consistency, because the ritual is the vehicle, but you need the inspiration and the spontaneity or the enthusiasm of the moment. So take Shabbat. Every week there's Shabbat, sundown Friday night. That's a ritual. But now you have to bring the inspiration of Shabbat, the internal feeling of Shabbat. Shabbat is a framework that is set by God. It's like the office of a high priest. God built it into nature, that every 7 days there's Shabbat. Come Shabbat, you light the candles, there's a ritual to be performed, a whole series of things to do on Shabbat. But on the other hand, within Shabbat, you have to bring your feeling of spontaneity, of excitement, of enthusiasm, of inspiration, right? So the priest represents the rituals, the structure, daily sacrifices, monthly sacrifices, everything's done ritualistically. It has a whole office to it, a whole wardrobe. But the prophet brings the message, meaning the deeper inward feeling. And why do I say this has to do with the daily prayers? I told you it's connected to your daily prayers, because there's two opinions in the Talmud why we pray every morning and afternoon and then evening. One is it has to do with the daily sacrifices, morning and afternoon, and then they ate the sacrifices at night, hence the evening prayer. That would be the ritualistic reason for prayer. But another reason is that it corresponds to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham instituted the morning, Isaac the afternoon, and Jacob the evening. What's the difference which opinion you follow? The opinion is very fundamental. If it's based on the priestly service, it's ritualistic. If it is based on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's more prophetic, meaning it's more from inspirational. So what people a lot of times say, well, how could you pray set prayers every day? And the answer is yes, you need to set prayers. That's the framework for prayer. But now you have to bring your kavanah, your intention, and your own message to the prayers. And that's why when we do the Amidah, we do it twice, not once. There's the silent Amidah where each person brings their own feelings, their own individual connection and relationship with God, like the prophet. But then you have the repetition of the Amidah, which is like the communal sacrifice, where we're the ritualistic. And I just want to point out, and this is a very lengthy subject, but rituals are important. We all know that in life. You see, people say, well, what do I need rituals for? I could just follow my heart, be inspired. And there's a lot of problems with that. The first problem is that it's not enough to feel inspiration. It has to be translated into something tangible. So let's say you climb a mountain, I don't know, Mount Everest, and you look out at the peak. It's a very inspiring, awesome, spiritual moment. You look out, or I don't know, everyone has their own. You go to the ocean, you go scuba diving, you look beneath the ocean, you're very inspired, right? There are spiritual moments, but how do you turn that emotion into a mitzvah, into a practical? Yeah, you had a great experience, but then the memory fades and it's gone. How do you translate it into something practical, right? So Judaism gives us mitzvot, which are the rituals, and the rituals carry the emotion, carry the inspiration, not just for yourself from day to day, week to week, in your own life, but also to transmit it to your children. How do you transmit what? And some days you'll feel the inspiration more than others. So you put on your tefillin every day. You remember the Exodus from Egypt, or you light Shabbat candles. I mean, you remember that God made the world in 6 days and rest. And some Shabbats you're more connected to the feeling than others. But the ritual is what keeps it in place every week. And then you have the Shabbat meal and all the things that we do to keep our relationship with God strong. We also need the framework of the rituals, and that's the priest versus the prophet. One more idea on this subject before we move on, and that is that when we talk about the Mishkan, which was designed last week with gold and silver and copper and beautiful wools, and now we talk about the garments of the high priest, and he had a beautiful breastplate with 12 precious stones on it. Here we now go into a new subject, which is visual. You know, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once said that Judaism is more like radio than like television. Other religions want to see their God, statues, idols. We want to hear the voice of God. God is not in the lightning and in the thunder. He's in the still voice. God tells Abraham, the first Jew, Lech lecha, go, follow my voice. That's the message. Surrender to the voice of God. God doesn't have a corporeal image. That's why Judaism doesn't believe in idolatry, because it's the greatest sin, because God is beyond the physical. But all of a sudden, the visual is introduced. Build a beautiful tabernacle with gold, silver, and copper, and all beautiful. The Kohen should have a beautiful headpiece and a breastplate and beautiful wardrobe. So when you came into the temple, you saw this magnificent structure, and you saw this beautifully ordained high priest. And the question is, I thought Judaism doesn't believe in the visual. That's why we don't know what Moses looks like. You know, when you read a book, the writer will describe the character. He looked like this. He was tall. He had dark hair. You have a picture. Torah doesn't tell us what Moses looked like, or what Joseph looked like, or what Jacob looked like, or like Abraham, because the visual is not really important. It's what they did and what they said and what they taught that matters. So why all of a sudden all the visual of what the Kohen looked like when he was dressed, and what the temple looked like, and perhaps what the message is that it's somewhat of a concession to human beings. In other words, after the golden calf, God says, you know, the Jewish people didn't want to just have a relationship with a God that's invisible. They wanted to have an idol, something they could see, something tangible, because human beings need to rest their eye on something to focus on it. And therefore, Maimonides talks about why do people love art and beauty and looking at beautiful things? Because beauty gives the eye something to rest on, and the soul rests. So the tabernacle is, okay, we don't believe in idolatry. We're not going to make statues or idols, God forbid. But we'll have a beautiful temple, a beautiful sanctuary, a beautifully dressed high priest. So the eye can rest on something visual, because visuality and being able to see has a big impact on the human soul, and therefore it enhances the experience. Until today, we have a mitzvah called Hidur mitzvah. Mitzvah is the actual commandment. Hidur mitzvah is the beautification of the mitzvah. We're supposed to beautify our mitzvot. So when Hanukkah or Shabbat candles come along, you could just put a candle on a tray and light it. But you buy a beautiful silver or some other decorative candlestick holder. Is that the mitzvah? No, the mitzvah is the candle that you light. That's the commandment. Asher k'deshana b'mitzvotav, you command us to light the menorah or light the Shabbat candles. But we put it in a beautiful object to enhance hidur, beautification of mitzvah. Your mezuzah on your door. The real mezuzah is the scroll. You could put it in plastic. You could put a mezuzah in saran wrap and put it on your door, and it's kosher. But we get a beautiful case to enhance the mitzvah. Our synagogue could just be a plain room, but we make our synagogues beautiful. That's the idea of the visual being. So even though clothing, we don't believe in defining ourselves by our clothing. People say clothing make the man. Well, clothing could also fake the man. Sometimes there could be a person who's very great and they're not dressed distinguishedly, and you think they're not important, and they can be the most important person. And then sometimes you could have a criminal God forbid, who's dressed in a suit and tie, and you think he's a prestigious person. So never judge a book by its cover. Never judge a person by his clothing. Clothing are not that significant. Surely not as significant as the person themselves. Who they are is what matters. But yet, when you come to shul on Shabbat, for example, you wear a beautiful suit or a beautiful dress, and you wear nice things. Well, why? Why don't I just come in my gym clothing or in my t-shirt? God doesn't care about my clothing. He cares about my heart and my mind and my soul and my inside. So why do I have to put on a nice shirt and a nice jacket or whatever I'm wearing? Come in jeans and a t-shirt on Shabbat, and you're welcome to come in jeans and t-shirt. You're always welcome, of course. But for Hidur mitzvah, in honor of the holiness of Shabbat, to make the day special, we wear nice clothing. Why? Because it enhances the experience. Just like when you go to a nice party or a nice dinner or a nice wedding, everyone's dressed beautifully, and that elevates the whole experience, because that's the way human beings are. When you see people dressed nicely, it makes us feel more special. And in order to make Shabbat feel special, that's what we do. So there is this concept of bringing the visual beauty even into a mitzvah. And even though a mitzvah is about what's happening inwardly, the good deeds, the inner good thoughts and actions, but we also understand that we need the physical attractiveness of the mitzvah as well to make the mitzvah literally more appealing. Okay, so when you go to a Shabbat table, it's decorated. You don't just come with plastic cups and plastic forks. You come with beautiful cutlery and dishes, and you make it beautiful and special and meaningful. I want to talk about the opening commandment, which is to crush the olives to make pure oil, because this is a very big subject. Why? Because the Talmud says the Jewish people are compared to an olive. What does it mean the Jewish people are compared to an olive? In what way are we compared to an olive? So rabbis say that just like for an olive to produce oil for illumination, which is the opening commandment, to bring the fresh oil for the lighting of the menorah, okay? In order to bring the fresh oil for the menorah, you have to crush the olives. So our rabbis say the Jewish people are like an olive. Yes, the Jewish people are crushed time and again, oppression, anti-Semitism, persecution. But like the olive oil, it only is produced through the crushing of the olive. And through the crushing of the olive, we produce the greatest light. Now, the statement is very, very true, because people always ask the question, how is it that this tiny nation that has been so oppressed for so many years have produced the greatest light? And the answer is, we're like the olive. The more you oppress us, the more light we produce. Whichever realm you want to look at it, spiritual realm, what we've contributed to morality, to ethics, to values, 10 Commandments, all the basis of, American laws based on Talmudic law, right? Or in every other field, sciences, arts, literature, all the Nobel Prizes, right? And it's not a given. There are other communities that are oppressed and they become downtrodden. It's unique that the Jewish people, the more you crush us, the stronger we become, the more light we produce. So it's not any time. Sometimes, in life, there are people who are abused, unfortunately, in life. They go through trauma and they become destroyed by it. The Jewish people have gone through so much trauma and still go. Look at Israel today. They need to bring a better example. The biggest crushing Israel ever got was October 7th, the biggest humiliation, the biggest horrors that ever happened. But look at all the light that's coming out of Israel now, the resilience, the strength, the courage, the beauty, the love, the unity. Amazing, right? That's the unique trait of the Jewish people. And you have to ask yourself, where does this come from? Because it doesn't happen by itself. And under pressure like a diamond, exactly. But it's not a given. Like I said, many communities get destroyed by oppression, so to speak. They don't produce more light. And it has to do with the mindset of a Jew. What is the mindset of a Jew? So we as a Jews don't believe in suffering. When I say we don't believe in suffering, there are other ideologies that say, oh, suffering is good for you because it cleanses you, whatever they may believe. Judaism doesn't uh, um, it doesn't idolize suffering as some kind of virtue. Okay, we don't want suffering. We don't welcome it. But when it does happen, our response as Jews is not why did it happen to us, because we know we're not God. We can't answer that question. Why did the Holocaust happen? Why did October 7th happen? Why? That's not the real question, because that's a question that's beyond our ability to answer. So the real question is not why, but now that it did happen, what am I going to learn from it? What am I going to do with or about what happened? And that's the ultimate question. And Jews have always asked that question. And because Jews have always asked that question, they always said, okay, how can I use what happened to create more light in the world, to transform the darkness, to fight the evil in the world, right? And therefore, something positive emerged from every negative experience. And therefore, the more negative experiences we had, the more light we produced. And like the olive, we became the Jewish nation, a light unto the nations, not despite all the suffering, but almost because of all the suffering. But it's not saying we want suffering, not saying we invite it or desire it, God forbid. But when it does happen, and inevitably in life, everyone has to suffer to some degree. And by the way, I should point out, someone said the following quote. They said, pain in life is inevitable. Suffering is optional. What did he mean? What he meant to say is that there's always going to be painful moments and experiences in everyone's life, unfortunately. But the question is, the pain is real. You can't change that. But the suffering is, according to this explanation, is holding on to the pain. So a simple, silly example is if you have little children and in the middle of the night, it's dark and you're walking out to get a drink of water and you step on a Lego piece on your bare foot and you go, ouch, right? And then it hurts. You can't avoid the pain of that. But then if you're all angry, why did my kid leave the Legos? And then, an hour later, you're still furious about it. The pain is gone, but now you're suffering unnecessarily. So that's just a general good rule in life that, sometimes we have to live with certain pains, but we don't have to self-inflict that pain upon ourselves and prolong it and turn it into suffering. So people sometimes are still walking around hurt about something that happened 5 years ago, and they're still carrying that with them, as opposed to saying, okay, it was painful, but now I don't have to carry that grudge. I don't have to carry that anger. I don't have to carry that resentment, and so on and so forth. So that's just another. So going back to the garments, the designing of the garments. When the Torah talks about the artisans who are going to design the garments, the Torah says that Moshe was told to speak to all the chachmei leiv, people who have wisdom of the heart. And that's a very interesting term. Why? Because wisdom we usually associate with the brain, not with the heart. But here it says wisdom of the heart. They're the ones who should fashion the priestly garments. And the question is, what is this idea of wisdom of the heart? And what it means to say is that, and if you know what Chabad stands for, it stands for Chachma, Bina, and Dat. Chachma is that idea. You get this great idea. That's Chachma. Bina is how you then develop the idea. Like a baby, right? When the sperm meets the egg, there's a connection, right? Sometimes we get an intellectual connection in our brain waves. We got a concept, an idea. But now, like the baby has to be developed for 9 months, it has to be fleshed out. The idea has to be developed and fleshed out. So that's Bina. What's Das? Das is how you connect that to your emotions. There's a neck that connects your brain to your heart. And sometimes a person could understand something, but they don't feel it at all. So to give you a simple example, there's an announcement that something happened, right? Give any example. It could be a good example or a bad example, Um, let's use a happy example. So and so won the lottery, right? Everyone hears the news. Everyone has the exact same information. They understand the same thing. So and so won $50 million. But the person who won it is jumping for joy. Why? Because his intellect, what he understands, went to his heart. Same thing with something sad. You know, I remember hearing the analogy that this guy couldn't speak English, so he got a letter that his father died. So somebody read him the letter and translated for him. He burst out crying. The guy who read the letter knew the information too. He told it to him, but he didn't cry because to him it stayed in his head. It didn't touch his heart. He was just the translator of the letter. The guy who heard the news that God forbid his father died, he broke down crying, right? So Chachmei Lev is people that not only is someone who has wisdom of the head, but wisdom of the heart. Okay, meaning to say that they also know how to internalize. Okay, they try to internalize and take what they understood and apply it to their emotions. And that's just the general rule of all wisdom. Wisdom is meant to, when a boy becomes a bar mitzvah, we actually call him a bar das. The main quality of maturity is das. Das means that it should affect your emotions. It shouldn't just remain in the intellect. You could have a very bright kid who's 10 years old and knows a lot. But until you're an adult, you don't know how to bind it with your emotions. Okay. And that's the idea of Chachmei Lev. People have wisdom, not just wisdom of the brain, but wisdom of the heart. Sometimes you ever heard the expression, some people are so smart, they're so open-minded, their brains fall out, right? It's just an expression, but there's a lot of truth to it. Sometimes you're so smart that you just don't get it. Your brains fall out because you're so smart. As opposed to a person who, what he understands, it touches his heart, it connects to his emotions. There's a very beautiful teaching of our rabbis that says, why did Aaron merit to wear the breastplate with the 12 tribes of Israel on it? And by the way, Pen, as you know, I think their insignia, their emblem is Urim v'Tamim, light and truth. It's basically the vestment of the high priest. How that came to be, I don't know. Maybe somebody here knows more about Penn and could tell us, but that's what they chose, I guess, the founders, as the biblical imagery to symbolize what their university stands for. This beautiful breastplate, Urim v'Tumim, where the Kohen would communicate to God. But our rabbis say something very beautiful, and they say, remember I told you that when Moses went to Egypt, God told him, don't worry about your brother, Aaron. He will be happy for you that you were chosen, okay? He won't be jealous, he'll be happy. So rabbis say the heart, and what God told Moses was, V'racha, he'll see you, v'samach belibo, he'll rejoice in his heart. So rabbis say the heart that was able to rejoice for his brother, that he was selected, even though he was the younger brother, and there was no jealousy. That heart should be the heart to carry the names of the 12 tribes of Israel and pray on their behalf. As you know, whenever Aaron went into the temple, he prayed for the Jewish people, especially in the holiest days, Yom Kippur, and the Holy of Holies. And the message is very profound. There's a law in Jewish law that when you send the chazan to pray for the congregation, to be the representative, the shliach tzibur, the emissary of the congregation, The rule is that the most important criteria is not that he has a nice voice. The most important criteria is that he only has love for the Jewish people in his heart. And it says that if the Chazan has an enemy in the congregation and he's thinking, my prayers should not be on behalf of that person, then his prayers are not effective for anyone in the congregation. So he has to be a person who, Jewish law says, Ratzui Lakol, he's beloved by the congregation. And he only has the best will and intentions for all of the congregation. So Aaron epitomizes the love. He was known as a peacemaker, a lover of peace, and he was rejoicing that his brother was selected, and therefore he merited to be the one to carry the names of all the tribes of Israel on his heart. And again, you may not be a priest. I'm not a Kohen either. We don't even have a breastplate anymore to serve in the temple. But these messages, what does it mean to be a Jew, to be a Kohen, to carry love in your heart for every person, to pray on behalf of every person, never to carry jealousy or anger or ill will towards another person. This is all the messages of the holy garments of the high priest. Another beautiful garment was called the tzitz. The tzitz was like a headband. You know how people wear sometimes the headbands? It was a headband that said two words, Kodesh Hashem, holy unto God. And this represented the idea of proper thoughts, that your mind should be kept sacred, holy to Hashem. And going back to this whole idea of why have a beautiful temple and why have a beautifully dressed Kohen Gadol, part of the reason is because when you came into the holy temple, there was a sense of reverence. You were inspired and you felt you were in a holy, sacred place. To create that feeling of sanctity, which I think every synagogue wants to create. We want to walk into a sanctuary and feel reverence, awesomeness. I'm in the presence of something bigger than myself, the presence of God. And why is that important? So, when you talk about ethics or morality, and Jewish law is all about ethical and moral behavior. Most people think about, well, what is just, what is fair, what is kind, what is compassionate. And all of that is true, obviously. And that's a big dimension of Judaism. But Judaism has another layer beyond being an ethical person. Is it enough to be an ethical person? It's a good start. You should be a good person. But ethics and morals is more between man and man. Holiness or sanctity is in terms of your relationship with God. When you have reverence for God, reverence is another word for respect, okay? So we want to take that sense of reverence and loyalty and fidelity to God and then transmit that into our interpersonal relationships as well, knowing that every person has a part of God in them. So if I say, it's a little early, a few more minutes. If I say, am I an ethical person, right? I treat everyone fairly. I treat everyone justly. I treat everyone kindly, for example, right? But does that mean I necessarily, if I'm asking you this question, right? If I say, well, there are lots of people I don't respect, but I'm still an ethical person. Could you be ethical and not respect people? Yeah, why not? Ethics doesn't mean I have to respect you. It just means I shouldn't hurt you. I shouldn't cheat you. I shouldn't lie to you. But Judaism doesn't just want us to be fair and just and ethical. It wants much more. It wants we should love one another. We should have respect for one another. We should have loyalty to one another. We should have devotion. We should have connection with one another, right? If I don't like people, I look down on people. I'm an ethical person. I would never cheat, harm, steal. I won't even speak bad about people. I'm moral. But Judaism says there's much more than just being ethical and moral. Spiritual means we're all connected. We're one. We're part of something bigger than ourselves. We're loyal to the group, to the community, right? As a Jewish people, look at the unity and the loyalty of the Jewish people. You may be an ethical person, Look at all the anti-Semitism today, right? And the biggest problem is the silence of the majority. Most people are not anti-Semites, but they're just quiet because they're like, why should I bother? It's not my problem. In Judaism, being a Jew is not just to be ethical. Don't stand by idly when the blood of your brother is being spilled. It's not just about being, it's about being loyal and showing respect for every person. And those are virtues that transcend just being ethical and moral. And therefore, the idea is that when you walked into the sanctuary and you saw the Kohen Gadol, you felt this reverence of God, this awesomeness, the presence of holiness, Kodesh Lashem. That's what it said on the forehead of the high priest on the headband. Remind you of this idea of holiness. Holiness means that we are all have to be humble in the presence of God who is infinite. And therefore, just like, and I'll just take it to this. If you open up Code of Jewish Law, in the very first paragraph of Code of Jewish Law, it quotes what many, many synagogues have on the Ark, including Palm Beach Synagogue. Next time you're in Shul, or if you see a picture of our Ark, what are the 4 words that it says on the top of the Ark? So on our Ark at Palm Beach Synagogue, it says, Da lifnei mi ata omed, 5 words. Know before whom you stand. Why is that on? And that's a play on what King David said. Shiviti Hashem lenegdi. I place God before me constantly. When you come into a synagogue, you read the sign, so to speak, over that. It says, know before whom you stand. You're now in the presence of God. Now you feel that. And what does that make you do? It makes you act humbler. And Jewish law says the following. It says, every person, all of Jewish law says, when you wake up, you should know that you're in the presence of God. And therefore, you have to conduct yourself properly. And this is what Jewish law says, quote unquote. The way a person acts and talks in the presence of a king is not the same way he talks and acts in the presence of an ordinary person. And therefore, if you always remember you're in the presence of the king of all kings, Almighty God, your words, your actions will always be loftier and more noble. And that's why we should always know that we're in the presence of Hashem. And therefore, even when you're in behind closed doors, you have to act appropriately. And that's why it's really not just the sanctuary that we want to create this feeling of reverence. We're in the presence of the king, talk appropriately, act appropriately in the presence of the king. And you could all imagine, if you went into the Oval Office and you're in the presence of the President of the United States, you're not going to talk the same way you talk to somebody in your kitchen, right? There's a different feeling of reverence. That's what you should feel in the synagogue. But it's not just in the synagogue. The truth is, when you walk into your home, you see the mezuzah. And when you come into your home, you have Jewish books on your shelf, and you have maybe a menorah, or Shabbos candlesticks, or other rituals that remind you of Hashem's presence. And the more you feel Hashem's presence, the more you humble yourself, and the more you scrutinize your actions and your deeds and even your thoughts and say, I'm in the presence of the king. How am I supposed to act appropriately? And when we act with one another constantly like we're in the presence of the king, then our actions are more loving, more respectful, more sacred. And that's the whole idea of the Mishkan and the visual presentation of the ark and the symbols in the sanctuary and the Kohen Gadol's breastplate that said holy to God, to remind us of Hashem's presence, not only when we're in the sanctuary, but when we leave as well, to take it with us for the rest of the day. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to seeing everybody Shabbat, God willing, okay? All the best. Bye.